You're living in a renovated farmhouse, far away from the big city. You're growing your own vegetables, you're collecting rainwater, and your little homestead is powered by sunlight. You're close to nature, and when you walk out your front door, there's no noise from cars or highways. It's just silent, fresh air. This might sound like every environmentalist dream, but if you want to live as sustainably as possible, you should actually be living more like this. Man, am I going to make some people angry. I'm just really disappointed in this video, but if you feel personally victimized by anything I'm going to say here, I am deeply sorry. The point of this video is to separate what's actually sustainable from the idea of sustainability, which is often used to mislead, misrepresent, and greenwash consumers. So we'll be debunking some eco-myths today, and perhaps add a tad bit more nuance to newspaper article headlines that you might already have seen. The point of debunking, and overall just adding more nuance to an otherwise very binary narrative, is so that we don't fall into the greenwashing traps in the future. The idea of smiling, happy people running through open fields wearing linen shirts and growing their own vegetables is a fairy tale that's very often used to sell us something. And it's so powerful that today, when we think about the most sustainable eco-life, we often think of something in the lines of that fairy tale. And there's a good reason as to why we buy into that narrative, because the majority of people today live in bigger cities, in urban environments, or in apartments. And the big isolated house in the middle of nowhere on the countryside with a big garden, well, it's the exact opposite of that. And I guess between the stress and the noise and the traffic and the garbage, we long for a more quiet life. However, that life might not be as sustainable as you think. When we're looking at where consumers have the highest impact, it's our house, it's our means of transportation, and it's our food. Because a lot of people live in a house or aspire to live in a house. They eat meat and they drive a car. This sounds like a simplification, but in fact, that is where the majority of our impact comes from. It's that behavior. And the idyllic life on the countryside increases two of these impacts. If you live on the countryside and in the middle of nowhere, you will most likely need a car to get around. Everything is likely going to be very far away, which means that you'll need a car because nothing will be in walking or biking distance, if biking is even an option. The countryside also very rarely offers well-connected public transportation. And take this from someone who grew up on the countryside where the bus came every 2 hours. My parents drove me everywhere. So people living in the countryside are very dependent on their cars, whereas if you live in a bigger city, it's much more likely that public transportation is going to be more accessible. Cities, or at least many cities, speaking from the privilege of being a European here, offers bike paths, pavements, and well-connected public transportation, which means that many residents don't really need a car at all. I don't even live in a big city, and it's well connected enough here so that I don't need a car. I bike, I walk, or I take the bus. Energy-wise, it's also a challenge because an isolated house uses energy less efficiently than an apartment building. When you have an apartment with neighbors below you, beside you, and above you, everyone uses less heating, meaning lower consumption of the resources that heating requires. In a house on an open field, it's a very different story. In an idyllic off-the-grid scenario, you might also be inclined to have a fireplace, and that's just one of the worst ways to heat your home. It's cozy enough, all right, but the emissions are not in your favor. Oh, there's also one more thing. So recycling systems are also going to be a lot more efficient in bigger cities. Rather than having those big garbage or recycling trucks drive kilometers and kilometers between each individual household, there are in cities a few designated pickup spots for the recycling truck, which means that the infrastructure for the recycling is a lot more efficient and environmentally friendly. And I want to talk about this because ever since I started talking about sustainability, I have received questions about how you can be sustainable even though you're living in a big city. Because seemingly all the things that we associate with living a more eco-friendly lifestyle are more accessible outside the city. Living on the countryside allows for a big garden where you can grow your own produce, it allows for space for a composting facility, and you can establish contact with local farmers to buy locally seasonal produce. And all these things are great, it's just not the majority of our carbon footprint. This might sound a tad depressing, or perhaps you can untighten your jaw because you're being more sustainable than you think. Either way, the most environmentally sustainable living arrangement is in a small apartment in a big apartment building. Let me paint you a word picture. You're living in your small apartment in a big apartment building on a massive boulevard, really broad, big apartment buildings on either side, and right next to it there's a metro going 24 hours a day. All the apartments on the boulevard are small and they require very little maintenance, and outside the city there's a cluster of windmills that provides targeted electricity to the city. There's just one thing here. Humans tend to thrive really poorly in that environment. The most ideal and optimized living arrangement might be environmentally sustainable, but does very little to consider human behavior and needs. Looking at human psychology and what makes us calm and happy are very different things from what is the most environmentally sustainable. In many ways, the most optimized, environmentally sustainable living arrangement could be stressful for many people, not only because of the 24-hour metro, but also because cityscapes like this leave very little room for green areas, nature, trees, parks, that kind of stuff, that you could argue soothes the soul a little bit. Even specks of nature in urban environments tend to calm us down, slow our breathing, and make us less stressed. And when they aren't prioritized because we are optimizing the environmentally sustainable living situation. Side note, but whenever nature isn't prioritized in city planning, it's not typically because of sustainability. It's mainly about cutting costs and saving money, just FYI. There are plenty of things to be said about high versus low income neighborhoods and how differently they include nature. We can get pretty stressed out, but there are also other issues at hand. If you have a big boulevard with huge apartment buildings on either side, that leaves very little shade for rain and sun, and that's not necessarily very comfortable. But they also create wind tunnels, and when you live in a neighborhood that's windy all the time, that can also stress us out. Then there's also the fact that neighborhoods like this that are very optimized in its environmental sustainability, where you're using the space in the most optimized way, leave very little room for community activities or for people to relax, get to know each other, or work as a community. As a result, a lot of residents in these neighborhoods feel very isolated. Neighbors are strangers, and that leads to loneliness, anxiety, and depression. Which ultimately means that a lot of people then tend to long for more calm environments in the countryside. Which means that we're back to where we started, where we're craving an environment that's the complete opposite of what our normal lives are situated in. But luckily it doesn't have to be so binary. We don't necessarily have to choose between grass and concrete, because more and more communities in bigger cities are bringing in some of that country life into the urban environment. We're seeing farmers markets in big cities, parks with seemingly isolated hiking trails, and community gardens. And all of these initiatives seek to bring some of that countryside calm into the city, and that has a tremendous effect on our mental health. However, the thing is, some of these initiatives might not be as sustainable as we think. A study published this year in 2024 highlights the misconception that homegrown vegetables and urban gardening is always more sustainable than conventional agriculture. Actually, this study suggests that homegrown vegetables and things grown in community gardens emit more CO2 per produce than conventional commercial agriculture. And while it might seem that we're taking a slight detour here, it's all gonna make sense in a second. But I really want to mention this because it's actually quite interesting. Community-run gardens were, according to this study, the most carbon-intensive of all, with 0.8 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per serving on average, versus the 0.07 kilograms of CO2 equivalent for conventional agriculture. Individual home gardens were somewhere in between at 0.3 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per serving of produce. Food production accounts for 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions, but of course only a tiny fraction of that actually comes from home farming. Homegrown vegetables account for a very tiny percentage of produce produced globally, but that doesn't mean that it can't take a toll on your individual carbon footprint. And according to the lead of this study, it wasn't actually surprising that conventional produce emits so little CO2 compared to homegrown vegetables, mainly because the industry that produces this professionally, conventionally, commercially, are under constant pressure to optimize their processes. They're pros at doing this as effectively and as cheaply as possible, which means that it also emits less CO2. However, one thing that I think is important to note when you read a study like this is that the data available from home farmers is significantly smaller than the data set available from commercial farms. The study collected data from 72 community-run gardens or home farms, which is basically nothing compared to the amount of LCA reports they had from commercial farms. And this is something to consider before you make assumptions about whether or not your home garden is more or less sustainable. At least I would have loved to see any journalist making headlines about this study take one fucking second. It is important because we're going for nuance here. It's not black and white. I kid you not, it seems like some of these journalists read like half an abstract and then ran with it. And that's simply too bad because we end up misrepresenting what the actual point is here, which I will be getting to now. One second. The reason why home gardens and community-run urban gardens tend to have a higher footprint is because of the 3 Ps: plastic, peat, and pesticides. People buy tons of products to optimize their homestead. farm equipment to planters, and they also use peat, which has a massive carbon footprint. And lastly, urban gardens and home farmers also use synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. At least when they do, that takes a big toll too. And could you say the exact same thing about conventional agriculture? Absolutely. But there are differences in the way these processes are optimized. But this is kind of good news. It means that your garden is not inherently unsustainable. It means that if you use secondhand gear, and if you use it year after year, if you avoid using peat, and if you use compost rather than synthetic fertilizers or pesticides, you can end up with a garden with an extremely low carbon footprint. And you can also grow high impact produce that commercially has some of the highest carbon footprints, like berries and asparagus, which in conventional agriculture may be flown distances or require energy intensive greenhouse facilities. These are great options if you both want to grow your own food and want to lower your carbon footprint. There are, however, some other upsides to urban and community run gardens in bigger cities. This other study from 2024 analyzed 39 community gardens in Munich and Berlin and found evidence of increased biodiversity. These gardens were havens for wild pollinators and bees, which often heavily struggle in urban environments, to the point where it's just a graveyard for biodiversity. And this study also highlighted some of the social benefits from community-run gardens, which the other study failed to mention. I guess failed to mention is kind of imprecise. It's simply just focused on greenhouse gas emissions. Overall, I think it's a fair conclusion that we shouldn't demonize home gardening or urban farms. But I think as consumers, it's important to know that planning and organizing these initiatives in a way that is sustainable and in a way where we're actually thinking about our impact is important, because it's not going to be inherently more sustainable. In the end, it comes down to how we run them. And this leads me back to the main question, which is how can we not only survive but also thrive while also looking out for our impact? I think it's important to remember that humans aren't designed to be optimal all the time. We're not meant to be at 100% effectiveness all the time. So while we have an idea of what a 100% sustainable ecosystem, sustainable neighborhood might look like, it's very likely that people aren't necessarily going to thrive there. So while we have to think about environmental sustainability, we also have to think about what makes us feel good. And one solution that I think is really worth mentioning here is 15-minute cities. This is an urban planning concept where the main idea is that residents should be able to reach everything they require in a matter of 15 minutes. This means designing local areas where we have everything we need within distance, making the time-consuming and emission-heavy car-centric traffic obsolete. This city planning structure favors bikes, walking, public transportation, as well as parks, community-based initiatives, and overall infrastructure that places humans in the center rather than industries. And good examples of this can be seen in Paris, or Melbourne, and Ottawa, Barcelona, and Shanghai. And I would also like to add Copenhagen in there, representing my own capital for a second. Overall, how we structure our lives and how we build our cities has a massive impact on the inherent carbon footprint of the residents in the city. But I think it's time to break up with the idea that you can only be sustainable if you move out of the city. The countryside isn't inherently more sustainable. But there's no way of getting around the fact that the building industry is one of the most polluting on the planet, not only because of its deep ties to fossil fuels, but also because it uses so much natural material. We use a lot of natural resources to build things in the first place. So how we structure our cities and how we build our cities is really, really important. Once again, going back to it's really important how we do things, not just what the end result is going to look like. The building industry is responsible for 40% of global CO2 emissions. It's responsible for 33% of waste and 50% of all extracted materials. Just take that in for a second. These are big numbers. In my last video, we talked about the impact of data centers and AI, where we talked about the fact that the internet has a carbon footprint that roughly equivalents to 3% of global CO2 emissions. 40%. 40. This is mainly due to the fact that we aren't very good at recycling building waste, and we're way too eager to tear down and build new rather than looking at ways of improving what we already have. Today, the average building has a lifespan of less than 39 years, mainly due to premature demolition. 39 years! We have built structures that have lasted literally thousands of years, and look where we are. This is low-key embarrassing. This is embarrassing. Buildings account for 21% of global greenhouse gas emissions according to the IPCC. So living in a smaller apartment is favorable to living in an individual house. The 3-bedroom, 2-bath ideal, which we have been sold since the 50s, simply cannot continue because we don't have the planetary resources to provide the population with that kind of living arrangement. Instead, we need to think about urban community activities and communal ways of living. This will be more and more necessary in the future. Living with fewer square meters is a good thing. Actually, it's one of the best things that you can do for the planet, along with taking public transportation and eating a more plant-based diet. This way, we both improve the house part of our impact as well as the car part and the beef part. Does this mean that you should feel bad if you have moved to the countryside or if you live in the countryside? No. This is about maintaining an overview so we can make the most informed decisions every day. Just like with the urban gardens, it depends on how we do things. Most likely there will also have to be a realization that not everyone gets to live out the idyllic country life dream. But then that doesn't mean that we can't be sustainable. In 2023, approximately 4.6 of the more than 8 billion people worldwide lived in towns or cities. This represents 75% of the global population, and by 2030, that figure is set to reach 60%. This is also about getting our facts straight and not leaving the idea of sustainability up to a team of marketing experts from a dairy company. When we're designing our lives, we should take environmental factors into account as well as our own needs and behaviors. And hopefully in the future, we will see more city planning efforts to make urban areas not just greener, but also more pleasant to live in. And yeah, that's a long way for some cities. But the reality is that cities house the majority of the population, but they also house the opportunities to make more sustainable urban living a possibility. That is everything for this video. I would love to hear what you guys think in the comments down below. Did this surprise you, or were you low-key not surprised? Also, let me know what your living situation is and where you live. Share with the group. I would love to hear. Again, there's no right or wrong answer. It's about how we do things, but I think it's really important that we establish an overview so we don't just go with it because we saw smiling people in a field in an ad. You catch my drift. And if you like this video, there's way more of this. So you can find all my impact analysis videos in this playlist. And generally, this platform is filled with how to be more sustainable, how to take responsibility for your own impact type content. Thank you so much for watching. Have an amazing day, and I will see you guys next time. Take really good care of yourselves. Until then, bye. Thank you so much for watching this video, and also a special thank you to my Patreon supporters. You guys help me create green, zero-waste content, and I love you guys. You can find the links to my social media accounts down below and the link to my Patreon on this screen. Bye!